I'd now like to ask Professor Dr. Christian Baatz, who's Professor of Climate Ethics, Sustainability and Global Justice at Kiel University in Germany, to talk to us about a human rights perspective on mitigation and adaptation. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Claire, and I'm grateful to the Royal Society and to Leopoldina for their kind invitation. I also brought just a few slides, and I added the term loss and damage to my pretty generic title because I think that better reflects what I'm going to say and also better aligns with what we are already discussing here today and yesterday. I'm coming from the perspective of moral philosophy, and hence I start theoretical, but trying to getting a bit more down to earth during my talk. And let me start with a person that was already mentioned earlier by Andrew, Henry Shue, which is, I think, one of the founding fathers of climate ethics. And Shue in 1980 published a book called Basic Rights, Subsistence, Affluence in US Foreign Policy, in which he proposed a then novel and quite groundbreaking understanding of basic or human rights. Shue understands moral rights as the rational basis for justified demand that the actual enjoyment of a substance be socially guaranteed against standard threats. That may sound more complicated than it actually is. Anyway, the point that's relevant here in the climate change context is, I believe, rather straightforward. And to illustrate that, I'll use another quote, this time not from Shue. Shue's point is that it's not feasible to protect human rights against all threats. Instead, we should protect human rights against predictable, remediable threats. I want to suggest that it is plausible to think of anthropogenic climate change as a predictable, remediable threat, written by another great British scholar, Derek Bell, more than 10 years ago. And I think this whole symposium shows that by now there's large agreement that for quite some time, climate change is both predictable and in principle also a remedial threat to the exercise of human rights. So for example, there's by now substantial evidence that fossil fuel companies knew about this serious danger already in the 70s and 80s, and what they then decided to do is, among others, to launch a huge denial campaign. Anyway, in the following, I would like to highlight 4 implications from this Shuean human rights perspective. The first is that associated with this rights understanding is a moral obligation to avoid or at least not increase climate-related threats. And that obligation translates into an obligation to avoid or reduce greenhouse gas emissions, also known as mitigation. Important follow-up question here is, sorry, I struggle with the different pictures, but anyway. So an important follow-up question here is who ought to mitigate how much? And I'm going to say a bit about duty bearers in a few minutes, but without saying actually anything on that now, I think it's very clear that many agents fail to meet that duty. And in that case, there are secondary duties of compensation to make up for that failure. And since the violation of this moral obligation creates the imposition of threats and not necessarily harm, 2 types of compensation are possible, which may be called ex ante or ex post compensation, so compensation before or after the exercise of human rights is interfered with. So the threats of a changing climate are usually addressed via adaptation, meaning that there, as you know, there's a duty to support adaptation where needed, especially in poor and vulnerable regions where people usually contribute very little to climate change, as has been stressed throughout the symposium. But there are limits to adaptation, and the international support for adaptation finance is meager. That has also been stressed. So there already are climate-related rights infringements, and there will be much more in the future. Therefore, there also is a duty to support measures addressing so-called loss and damage. And in this framework presented here, this duty also entails rectification or even reparation. And before moving on to the next point, I would like to highlight two issues related to these two types of compensation. So the first is that given the political opposition to everything that's called compensation, I believe it's better to maximize this kind of silent compensatory mechanism via adaptation and loss and damage, rather than pushing for official recognition of wrongful harm infliction, for example, by so-called restorative justice or reconciliation processes, as is increasingly proposed. My second point is that even if international finance is increased considerably, and we certainly must work towards such a considerable increase, but even then it will not even suffice to meet human rights related adaptation needs. So, and since avoiding harm is better than redressing it afterwards, it actually may still be reasonable under these conditions to spend the lion's share of international funding on adaptation. That's my second point. Who ought to mitigate and finance adaptation and loss and damage measures? There are different normative principles that in theory identify different agents. So we have the polluter pays principle, the beneficiary pays principle, ability to pay principle, and a couple of more kind of related principles that are relevant in this context. However, I think that in practice, they roughly point to the same set of agents. So in a nutshell, the wealthier you are and the more you emit, the bigger and stronger is the duty to reduce emissions and to contribute to mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage measures elsewhere. So by now, given kind of past developments over the last decades, there are quite a number of stringent moral duties. And Shue also played an important role in establishing this conclusion. And I would also like to highlight that that duty not only holds for states, but also for organizations and individuals, at least in my personal opinion, so to say. So that brings me to the fourth and final implication. So from a human rights perspective, individuals are the entitlement bearers. So that is support for adaptation and loss and damage is ultimately owed to them. And that may not sit easily with the so-called principle of country ownership. Developing countries argue that adaptation and loss and damage finance is compensation, thus belongs to them, and it's illegitimate to tie that funding to conditions. But I believe that only holds if here the country, in the principle of country ownership, refers to the people and not the government or other or the legislature. So, but given that countries and countries not just in the global south often do not use funding to benefit their vulnerable, poor, and marginalized groups, I think it is in principle permissible to make financial support for adaptation and loss and damage measures conditional, but only if these conditions aim at and are suitable to increase the likelihood that the poor and vulnerable are the principal beneficiaries of the funding. And I believe that conclusion would be quite controversial in COP negotiations. And I think I'll stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very, very much for those remarks. And indeed, your point that the wealthier you are, the more you need to contribute to loss and damage measures.